Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome here in the Balie, also for viewers at home. Very good that you're watching this program, The Emergence of China's Smart State. And this program is a cooperation between the Balie and the Leiden Asia Center. My name is Floris Harm. I'm the managing director of the Leiden Asia Center, and I will chair this conversation tonight. It's actually the second of two programs that we do this year in conjunction with the Balie. The first one was in December, was where we discussed concerns about growing Chinese influence on our society and on people from China in the Netherlands. But tonight we're talking about China's digital development. What are China's technology ambitions and capabilities, and how does this affect their dealings with, in political and economic sense, with the rest of the world? In a moment, I will ask our main speaker, Rogier Creemers, to take the floor for a brief presentation. And after that, we will talk with him and another researcher about China's technology ambitions. We will also have a third speaker, a very interesting man with a background in diplomacy and business. And we will talk about his views on the matter. And with him and others, we will talk about how China's cyber capabilities and ambitions affect its relations with the outside world. And of course, there's definitely room for questions from the audience at the end, but maybe also somewhere in between. In fact, when it comes to the audience, I'm curious who we have amongst us today. So here we go. If I can have the... Yeah, very good, thank you. I'm curious, just by raising your hand, who here works with China or Chinese topics? Let's keep it as broad as we can. That's definitely not everybody. So who is here out of just a general interest, who just thinks that it's a good topic? Oh, that's the majority, very good. And who here, third question, is working in the cyber domain, let's say, with technology or anything? Okay, that's a few. Definitely not the majority, some not 100% sure. Who here is worried when we were talking about this topic, the emergence of China's smart state? Just by raising your hand. Excellent. Let me just, this is a former colleague, so this is a thuiswedstrijdje. But if I may be so blunt, what specifically worries you?
Oh, wow. Maybe it's mainly because I don't know everything what they're doing, so I just don't get it, all the things. I mean, I'm not specialized in technology, so mostly worries are about not knowing what another is doing. So it's also, I think, about, I mean, I work in the media, but also about reports in the media and all these things that you start to get worried. But maybe it's not fun, you know, it's not really funded on real facts.
Right. It's a general unease, and that comes to a large extent from not knowing, basically, right? Is the unawareness. Well, perhaps we can try tonight to clarify a couple of things that are not so clear. Just again, one more time, who here is worried? Let's see. Okay, well, let's see if by the end of the evening, perhaps it's less. Okay, so let's continue with the program. And I'd like to invite Rogier Creemers to take the stage. Rogier Creemers is an assistant professor in modern China studies and editor of this newly published book, The Emergence of China's Smart State. And this book talks about the extent to which the Chinese government has been able to achieve its digital goals and what that says about China and what it means for China's relations with the rest of the world. Well, Rogier is, I mean, it's a fantastic book. He did a really great job together with a whole number of leading authorities in the cyber domain. Rogier is one of them, I think maybe the leading expert in at least the Benelux, if not Northwest Europe. So Rogier, thank you very much for joining us. And please, for the next presentation, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Floris, and obviously thank you all for either coming to the Balie or logging into the Balie if you join us online. I'm very proud that we've been able to get this book together. It is a joint effort with a dozen of wonderful people who have specializations that range from China's approach to fintech, to China's role in global semiconductors, to China's offensive cyber capabilities, to the development of regional innovation clusters, and how does China and particular Chinese regions actually become centers of excellence in the digital economy. In other words, we cover a very wide breadth. I'm very grateful for that wonderful collaboration. I'm also very grateful, and I think it's very appropriate for me to start with this, for the support that we have gotten from our funder, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and specifically the Cyber Task Force. Later on, we will be showing you the webpage of the book where you can, thanks to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs support, you can download the electronic version of this book free of charge. So it is just publicly available. And depending on where you fall in the recent elections, that's either a great public serving use of your tax euros or it's a left-wing hobby. I leave that up to you to decide. But just so to say, one of the things that we try to achieve with the book is that we have more and more people all around the world who are doing very enlightening work on where China is going in all of these different aspects of the digital realm. We didn't want to lock it behind a paywall or very high book costs. I mean, if you want to get the physical example, it is going to be a little bit expensive because that's just the economic model, but the content is free. And we wanted it to be freely available to anyone and everyone who is either helped or entertained by this book, or in the worst case scenario, is suffering from insomnia and needs a remedy. So why did we write this book, and what did we write this book about? Well, partially, you know, the best reason to write a book is to be deeply frustrated about things. And in my case, my frustrations when I look at the way that we engage with the question of China and technology stem from, I think, a number of, I wouldn't call it biases, but certainly a number of trends that we see in the way that we engage with China and technology. The first is we particularly focus on very specific political topics. We focus on censorship, we focus on information control, we focus on surveillance. And I'm not saying that these topics are unimportant. I'm not here to make the Chinese Communist Party's case for it or to defend Xi Jinping. I think he is more than capable enough or well-funded enough to do that for himself. But I am saying that that's only a very partial picture of a much, much, much broader landscape. And so the point that I wanted to make in my 15 minutes here is that technology in China as a topic is important, that it is interesting, and that it is necessary that we develop a far better understanding, regardless of where we stand on China politics-wise, regardless on how pro or anti-China we are. We need to be informed by a much deeper understanding about what is going on in China, but also how it fits or how it impacts us, how it creates or influences the geopolitical tensions that we are now much and much more in, and what it actually means for us where China is going as a technological player. So let me start with the first point. China is important. Just some numbers. I did something miraculous a couple of weeks ago. I bought one of these. My old one, the battery was stone dead, so I bought a new one. This is one of the most sophisticated machines that humanity has ever produced. The semiconductors in them, as we all know by now, are produced through processes that are on the verge of bending the laws of physics, and yet these machines are available in shops at a reasonable price. Just to guess, how often do you think Apple makes an iPhone every day? In other words, how many iPhones a day does Apple make? Any guesses? Pardon?
1 million.
Close. 800,000. Imagine what it takes in terms of supporting infrastructure to do that, right? Because you have 800,000 sets of components that all need to be developed, that all need to be manufactured, that all need to arrive at the factory at the same point in time to go into 800,000 phones that then need to be taken out of that factory, that need to be divided across shipping containers and shipped all over the world. Just the logistics, the infrastructure that is necessary to do that is enormous. And that's just Apple, right? There's also Samsung. Huawei is back. There is Oppo. There are all the other mobile phone makers. And all of them are manufacturing their stuff in China. Don't take my word for it. Take Tim Cook's word for it. There is currently no alternative for Apple, the largest company in human history by stock market valuation. There is no alternative to China for Apple. So just in terms of providing us with the material means that we need to live in our digital society, China is, at the very least, at this point in time, irreplaceable. China is also important for other reasons. It is a major originator of cyber hacks, attacks, and espionage against European infrastructure. We are, as was evidenced by the previous event here in the Balie, increasingly concerned about the potential influence that China might try to exercise on our democratic processes. Although recent events suggest that we don't need China to ruin our democracy, we are very good at that ourselves. China is important, therefore, in economic terms. It is important in political terms. It is increasingly important in social terms. And that means that we owe it to ourselves to try and figure out exactly why China is so important, right? And this is, there are just some ideas for us to think about. But China, for starters, is important because we have come to rely on the easy availability of manufactured goods, and we get angry when those manufactured goods do not show up. We have come to rely on the fact that when our phone breaks, we can get a new one. And if you look at it in macroeconomic terms, there's all kinds of nice graphs to suggest that for the last, call it 20, 25 years, every life essential has been getting more expensive. Housing, schooling, food. But we haven't noticed that because the effect of China on lowering the prices of manufactured goods essentially, to a very significant degree, maintained purchasing power in Western societies. We seem now to be at a turning point, and that turning point isn't just the result of COVID, it is also the result of China now adjusting its economic policies, which means that the relationship that we have had to each other is also changing. So China is important, we cannot afford to ignore it. China is also interesting. And obviously, when you're a geek like myself, who thinks for some reason that they should be reading extremely dry policy documents on a daily basis, that's a foregone conclusion. But my job is to convince you why it is interesting. One reason is this. We, for some reason, still think of China as being a country that's catching up. Right? A country that started from behind. And actually, that is how, in very many cases, Chinese people have looked at their own country, right? When we welcome Chinese law students, for instance, to the Netherlands, very often, until very recently, what they would come to do is to study how laws in Europe work, to then bring those ideas back to China and modernize their legal system. But in very many areas, those days are over. When it comes to questions on how to regulate new technologies or how to even develop new business models, China is, in very many cases, far ahead of us. China, for instance, has already started regulating generative AI solutions where the United States seems to be politically gridlocked to even start working on regulation, and where the European Union tries to build these massive pieces of regulation to do everything in one go, and it takes years. And it may well be that China becomes an example of how not to regulate things, but that is interesting too. Right? China is out there playing around, building new models of how to govern a digital society, sometimes influenced by the non-democratic nature of its politics, but very often not. and I'm going to be a bit provocative here, but where it comes to many issues of market regulation in the digital sphere, for instance, online competition law or consumer protection law, or even personal information protection law, the European Union is closer to China than it is to the United States. We are, in some cases, very, very similar in how we approach questions on how to actually manage the online economy, how to manage digital processes. But China is also really interesting because, in very many ways, it has come from so far behind. Right? China has become a pioneer in fintech for the very simple reason that, when Jeff Bezos founded Amazon, all he had to do to process payments was to go to the offices of Visa, MasterCard, diners, sign an agreement, and he could process payments. If you are, however, Jack Ma, and you try to build an e-commerce shop in a country where the vast majority of transactions, even very large transactions like buying a car, take place with large stacks of the little red 100 yuan notes that still have Mao's face on them, it's really difficult to jam those into a laptop to process payments. China was a completely underbanked country. And so in order to develop an e-commerce environment, Chinese businesses actually had to build up their own stuff. And that has been true in very many areas where Chinese businesses, by dint of the very fact that China was so far behind, had to be extremely creative and agile in problem solving. We see that in software, we see that in hardware. Why is China become so good at building up its own smartphone brands like Oppo, like Xiaomi, like Huawei, that can make high-featured phones at very low prices? It is because for a very significant part of the 2010s, you had a parts economy in Shenzhen at which people were in small shops continuously iterating off each other, developing off each other. You get a really interesting sort of cluster of excellence that leads to very, very rapid progress in hardware development. And so across the range of whether you're interested in business models, online services, hardware, whether you're interested in regulatory approaches, when you're a legal nerd like myself, things are happening in China in a way that is very different from the way they happen here. Obviously, we very often leap to judgment, but I would like to invite you to every so often suspend judgment and just sort of try and engage with what is happening there and why it is happening there. We might learn something. And sometimes that might be, we might learn what not to do. But there are very, very many fascinating things that happen there that we very often have looked down on. As recently as 2014, the Harvard Business Review was publishing papers with titles like "Why China Cannot Innovate," which seems to now, let's just say that take hasn't aged well. I believe it's not based, it's cringe. The problem with that is that when we approach China from our own lens, we almost immediately and consciously stop ourselves from understanding it. And this is the last point that I want to make. We very often get China wrong because we want to get it wrong. And partially that's because, let's put it out there may be a little bit of racism, the Asians can't think for themselves. They can only copy because their Confucian culture militates against their inventiveness, or they're communists and they can only learn by rote and they haven't got a properly free society like we do, right? All of these things stop us from understanding why we are currently faced with what we are faced. And that is the fact that we might have to realize that the major thing holding China back from true innovativeness was that China was poor. And in very many ways, China no longer is poor. China's per capita GDP in the year 2000, when I started studying Chinese, was below $1,000 per capita per year. Last year, China's estimated per capita GDP was 12,500 euros. That's a bit of an increase. Granted, that is still only about a quarter of the per capita GDP of the Netherlands. But it also indicates in very blunt ways what China's challenge is and what our challenge resulting from that is. China wants to essentially become as wealthy as we are. And why wouldn't they, right? We rather enjoy it, and I'm not sure that the Dutch electorate would appreciate it if we told them that we would halve our per capita GDP, right? We quite like the prosperity that we have. Chinese would like to have it too. So Chinese leaders are faced with a conundrum. Even after 40 years of breakneck economic growth, they still have to quadruple their per capita economic output just in order to achieve that goal. How are they going to do that? You know, when economists talk about growth, they very often pretend like it's a magical something that you can sort of turn on and off when you twiddle a few buttons. But growth has to be realized by actual economic activity. And this is where China faces challenges, sees opportunities. This is where the structural relationship between China and us is changing. I showed you my phone just now. It cost me about 1,000 euros. Anyone want to guess, of that 1,000 euros, how much of it stays behind in China where the phone is made? Any guesses? Pardon? That's true. Little, but how little is little? 10%. For an iPhone that costs about 1,000 euros, about 20 euros stays in China. You know, we don't have the hard numbers. Apple is very secretive about that, but a phone that costs about 1,000 euros, Apple is estimated to pay about 400 euros as it leaves the factory. The vast majority of that is either the profit of the subcontractor or the components that go in there, most of which aren't manufactured in China. Best known, obviously, the semiconductors that are manufactured by TSMC with ASML machinery. Yay, Veldhoven. When you're a Chinese leader and you look at that figure, when you're a Chinese leader and you see that of all the intellectual property receipts generated worldwide in 2021, which is the last year that I could find numbers for, only 3% went to China, you see that you still have a mountain to climb in terms of developing the high-income economy that China believes, that Chinese leaders believe they need in order to achieve similar prosperity. And this is where the problem is, right? This is where the problem is coming in for us. We think it's great that Apple can build phones for us for 20 euros a pop, right? That's fantastic. That's complementary. And for quite some time, it was in China's interest to be a low-value added manufacturer of stuff because that's better than what came before. But now we're at a point where China is a middle-income country and where, in order to progress economically, it needs to start competing with us for those high-value added activities that we prefer to keep for ourselves, because they generate our far above global average levels of wealth. And it cannot be otherwise, right? Economically speaking, just look at semiconductors. It's an ecosystem with companies like TSMC, ASML coining it at the top, and somewhere at the bottom there's an African child scraping some cobalt out of the ground in a bucket in very unpleasant circumstances, right? And China is in the middle of those two, and it wants a much bigger share of that slice. And one area where you already very clearly see where this is going is electric vehicles. I am old enough to remember when China wasn't in the top 15 of car exporting countries, because that was 4 years ago. Since this summer, it is number 1. And a lot of it has to do with the growth of its electric vehicle sector, strategically supported by the Chinese government, looking for essentially opportunities to capture the commanding heights of the future economy, because they want to be as wealthy as we are. And what they have done is experimented with ways, some of which detailed in this book, to come up with ways of policy support, ways of organizing education, infrastructure, and all the rest of it to make that possible. And not all of it has been successful, but very much of it is. And so when we are worried about China, very often we are worried about the political things, right? We are worried about surveillance. We are worried about censorship. I was one of the first people to write about the social credit system, you know, that infamous thing that actually doesn't quite exist. And the question that I got all the time is, will this social credit system come to the Netherlands? To which my response always was, we live in a democracy, right? If we don't want it to be here, it won't. But Chinese electric vehicles definitely are already coming to the Netherlands, right? And it is really interesting to see how we very often look at China as being a political challenge, a challenge to our values, right? Or even by its very existence, a challenge to our worldview. Didn't Frank Fukuyama tell us that we were at the end of history and liberal democracy would always win? How can China not only exist but be successful? Whereas for China, this is an economic challenge. And I believe it is a tension that will define, far more than our current spat with Russia, the future of the way we live our lives. Thank you very much for coming here. I hope you enjoy the book.
Thank you very much, Rogier. It's always a huge pleasure to listen to you. What did you call it? Rant? Very good, very good. Excellent summary of the situation in China. I'd like to invite our second speaker, Ms. Guangyu Qiao. While she's coming over here, I'll introduce her. She's an assistant professor of international relations at the Radboud University, studied law and international relations in Shanghai, and did her PhD in Melbourne University and has been in the Netherlands only since February. So we're very honored and pleased that you're here. Thank you so much for joining us. And your research tries to interpret legal and foreign policy instruments developed by the Chinese government. Listening to Rogier, I'm curious how you look at this. Listening to Rogier, one might get the impression that China has his act together in an amazing way. I mean, it's really very well thought through, and that it's all sort of like a big master plan. How do you view the developments in that respect?
Yeah, okay. I think I agree with every sentence Rogier said before, definitely. But I would say I kind of like interpret China's like tech ambitions and the capabilities like in a slightly different way. So I would say, yes, indeed, that China has achieved major progress like in the last few decades in technology development, and also the government has like this like ambitions to become a tech leader, but also what I see is that like we seem to like have this tendency to exaggerate this China's tech ambitions and also capacities to a certain extent. In terms of this like tech ambitions, I think I work quite a lot with like many scholars based in China, and then so when we communicate that, they often took issues with this like translation of Chinese policies in the West. So very often that you see rhetoric such as China going to become a tech superpower by 2030, for example, or become the dominant cyber power by a certain time. And then, however, like in Europe, if you look into this, like the Chinese version of policy documents, and then they would translate this as as one of the powers. And then, so it's just like China is ambitious, but like just sometimes that I feel like just like there's some sort of like a meaning that are lost in translation. That's like just seem to be not pick up in West rhetoric, narrative. And also maybe also the tech capacities. Like I feel like as a Chinese myself, I'm also quite proud of like what China has achieved over the past decades. But also like just in addition to what Rogier has shared before, I also do feel that China is still facing some challenges to actually leapfrog Western countries to become a tech
What are
power.
those challenges, if I may? What are those challenges?
So I think, for example, the challenges to attract and retain talent, I think that's one of the challenges. And then, there are also challenges related to this China's economic slowdown, and then therefore this reduced fiscal resources to support its technology development, and also, of course, it's kind of a series of sanctions imposed, especially by the U.S. on its tech sector, I would say. I would totally agree that China is becoming a tech power, but just feel to what extent, that's probably a matter of a question.
But I think the general audience hears slogans like China 2049, then they will want to be the biggest economy, or they have caught up, and China 2030, and all those sort of those long distance goals, let's say. The general audience then thinks that that's a real ambition and that they're moving towards that. But are you saying it's just rhetoric? I mean, rhetoric? It's just a slogan?
I think China has this a track record of actually achieving its ambitions, right? And then, so it's indeed that, so it has this goal by 2049, I think, to become a middle income country. And then, so I think it's actually on the trajectory to achieve that. The thing is that I'm not saying that China is not going to become a tech superpower, but that its ambitions not to become the absolute dominant power, but actually become one of the powers. I think just how we interpret that is a bit of...
I see. Rogier, do you want to...
Yeah.
It's really interesting how we talk about countries, because if I were in industry, that's not how I would look at it at all, right? For the last 20, 30 years, we've been building up our global economy on the presumption that borders really didn't matter and that economic activities had to be performed there, where they could be done most efficiently. And that leads us to a situation where, a chip between, starting out as a virgin silicon wafer and actually being installed into a finished good may well have crossed borders 5, 6, 7 times in different stages of the production process, from raw material to finished goods. But now, for some reason, the reason is very clear. We are starting to be far more concerned about China as a geopolitical and economic rival than we were in the past. We are now essentially saying this approach where we created these globalized economies without paying too much regard for borders, as long as it served economic efficiency, these days are now over. But the thing is, no one can produce all this stuff by themselves. As I just said, Apple cannot exist without China. China cannot exist without Apple. And so the question really is, if we are actually going to nationalize, if we're actually going to de-risk, how far does that go? And I mean, Brexit gives just one comparatively very small case study of what it looks like when you try and unscramble that economically integrated omelette.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, speaking of de-risking, so I think...
Speaking of de-risking.
I think Rogier mentioned that, right, briefly. And then, so this is a topic I touch on quite a lot in my work. I think that one of the major concerns in the West is that China's technological development is going to be used to upgrade its military. I think that this is kind of the reason used by the U.S. To impose the sanctions, especially on this semiconductor industry. And then my concern is also about this kind of increasing dual-use nature of technologies, including AI and also cyber technologies and so on. And then we see this kind of the lines between civilian and also military applications of technologies are increasingly blurring. And then to a certain extent that I feel we need to figure out just kind of this a breaking point to maybe of course, like to preserve this European economy while like not actually make a policy like beyond any breaking point that it actually will just sacrifice this like economic and social developments in China and also other parts of the world.
But to clarify, you are concerned about the dual use of certain technology. Is that what you just said, or did I get you wrong?
I think my concern is about more this like over securitization and also militarization of technology policy. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you. This is a very interesting point, because for that I'd like to introduce our third speaker, Jaap van Etten. Jaap is founder and CEO of Datena, which is an open source intelligence platform on China's techno-economic system. And Jaap's just telling me that he's been involved in technology and science since 2005. In fact, between 2006 and 2014, he worked as a diplomat at the Dutch embassy in Beijing and at the consulate in Shanghai. Specifically as the science and technology attaché. I understand that you tend to be careful with your public appearances, so we're very happy to have you here. So please give him a warm hand. Thank you very much for joining us. Why did you choose to attend this, to speak out, let's say?
Well, for me, this comes at the core of my knowledge of China, and actually the core of our company. So I think this debate is key to have an open debate on the challenges that a rising China in terms of science, technology, economy, and military. We will touch upon the topic tonight. Brings to the world. China wants to grow 4 or 5% a year for the coming decades. If they can't increase their own local consumption, that 4 or 5% growth has to come out of other markets. So,
like Rogier just said, you know, China. We need China. China needs us too to keep their economy growing. Is that what you say?
Indeed. And I think that for nationalistic, military, and economic reasons, China does want to become a science and technology powerhouse. I wrote it in 2014, slightly more on case than the HBR publication. In itself, of course, they are very open about this. I was the first diplomat to visit, after 20 years, the Chinese Institute to deal with national defense and dual-use technologies. They were very clear about the technologies that they wanted to incorporate in their military. I think in that sense, it's, for us as the West, we've become complacent. And I think that yes, it's way better. Apologies for that, if you didn't hear the first part. The Chinese are just more hungry for success. I really liked the Chinese business environment when I was there. The enthusiasm that they wanted to build a company. Here, people want to go home at 5 o'clock to eat their potatoes. Completely different mindset. But with that mindset, if you focus it in science and technology, in the economy, and also in their military ambitions, you just get a player on, that becomes a global player. And I think that, well, that's actually, Rogier, you really touch upon that point when you said that they have certain ambitions and you should decouple that discussion from whether China is bad or not. That's not the discussion that we should have. It's more like, what will a rising China mean for our economies and for our security? And
so can you answer that question?
Yes,
please.
I can. I think we're in deep trouble. Honestly speaking, when I started in China, there were 1 or 2 publications per year in Nature by Chinese researchers.
In Nature?
Nature.
In the magazine, right.
In a magazine, so top-notch scientific publications. Now they dominate, if you take the 50 key technologies of the world, they dominate probably 45. 45, maybe I'm giving it 43. And the other 7 are US. 0 Europe. Maybe on university level, quantum technology, Delft, go Delft. I'm Eindhoven University, but still like Delft, do your thing. It's a completely different mindset. Quantum technologies, the Chinese parliament was informed about that in 1998. 1998, start educating people in politics about quantum technology. I was the only engineer at their embassy. The only one. There were like 50 people there. I was the only engineer. It's really hard. Like sometimes I was looking at the Chinese ministries like, okay, again an engineer, educated in Germany, educated in the US. Of course, they can have a much better science and technology policy than we have. So we're playing catch up. In that sense, like, the software that our company builds, it's actually one of the largest China research center in the world, except we don't do research. We build software to keep track of all the scientific developments.
What does that software do to be specific?
It collects all the open source information that's available on China, merges that together into a software platform that governments around the world can use to make hopefully better policy on China.
Because what does it show, the software? What is the data that comes out of it?
The data is all kind of connection between companies, researchers, research organizations, the government, also a military cell fusion. So it gives a clean, crystal clear mapping of that.
So you have a company and you look at it and you have no idea what the background is, and you do a sort of X-ray of all the different interests that are. And so what do you see?
Yeah, for instance,
what are the things that you that are striking about that? How large is the influence of government, for instance, in companies that at first face value don't seem to be government-run?
Of course, you should expect that the Chinese government is involved in a lot of companies because it's a state-run economy. Mm-hmm. But you see a high correlation between where the state is involved and what are key technologies. So in the fashion industry, you see much less state involvement. And in the West, we're really not used to that, to the extent that people get investment from companies. So they have a European company with key technologies where they're supplying our European military, but they have a joint venture in China with a company that supplies the Chinese military. Is that wise? I don't think so. And 9 out of 10 times the companies don't know. So there I feel like, if key technology leaks, like, it's difficult to get back. And technology it's more and more important. Yes, it is a difficult topic to talk about military technology because it quickly goes into the wrong direction. But we shouldn't also not be not clear about the fact that
we shouldn't be naive.
Shouldn't be naive. Yeah. If you just look at javelins being used in Ukraine, like they were like a big hit, pun intended. But they rely on really fast, energy-efficient chips. Decisions have to be made while flying such a rocket. That's only possible with key new semiconductor technology. Well, if you don't want that to end up in a other military, you shouldn't sell it. So that's a decision that policymakers have to make.
And it's actually really interesting that you indicate that, because it illustrates, I think, the complexity of a challenge that we're only starting to begin to understand. And that is that once upon a time, not very long ago actually, advanced technology almost by definition was military technology, right? The military had jet bombers before we got civil jet airliners. The military started with nuclear tech. Until the end of the Cold War, computers were military espionage, encryption, decryption tech. And it's only really since the end of the Cold War that we've moved to a world in which civilian technology is far more advanced than the military. And military essentially uses civilian technology. And that changes the discussion, right? Where a lot of our ideas surrounding how do we stop the PLA from getting its hands on these advanced technologies are based on ideas on arms control that date back to the nuclear, chemical, biological warfare era. Now, the problem with nuclear tech is that it's only held by a very small number of states. Within those states, it's held by a very small number of actors for a very small number of applications, right? I still do not have my nuclear-powered hoverboard, damn you. But when it comes to semiconductors, pretty much the most advanced semiconductor chip that you can buy for any money, I have in my pocket because it's in my phone, right? So we are faced with this problem that where our traditional ideas about arms control and limiting the capabilities of our opponent by denying access to technology to them, are now being combined with the fact that we are economically so intertwined with China in a way that creates these enormous interdependencies which we're only just starting to comprehend.
I think if people look back at the Cold War or make reference to that, that's completely irrelevant. The Cold War, Russia tried to copy technologies and then ship it into the military. That doesn't work because you need an economy to support your military. So you can't do that. So there, I think it really goes wrong if you make a comparison with that.
Can I ask, Ms. Chow, so there is the strategy of the US to kind of choke China's development. We were just talking about semiconductors, the development of the state-of-the-art semiconductors. Because of that boycott or that ban on sales of ASML machinery, for instance, to China, what do you see happening in China when it comes to the development of its own semiconductors?
I think the government issued some subsidies and also plans that definitely increases technology independence. I think this is kind of probably a step that's not surprising. What I want to also kind of just draw attention to is this kind of these negative implications on actually arms control. Just at this UN level, and then so there's some active discussions on this arms control against this militarization of AI. So especially under this UN CCW framework, so this convention on certain conventional weapons, on lethal autonomous weapons, and then I think China was quite just active at the beginning in supporting a legal ban of autonomous weapons, and then when the U.S. imposed sanctions on its AI industry and also semiconductors, and then suddenly China seems to be just not that active in pushing for a legal ban anymore. And then so I talked to some scholars, so they are actually concerned about this spillover of regulations in the name of national security and military security, this a spillover into this commercial and or civilian development of AI developments. So this is I feel it's just implications that of course China is taking action to improve its independence, and also I feel it's dangerous for this arms control as well. Yeah.
Thank you. I promised the audience the possibility to ask some questions. Are there any questions by any chance from people in the room? Yes, Mr. Sir. Hang on, let me just get this one, because that makes it easier, I think. Or maybe in this case it's not really necessary, but I'm going to come over so you can ask the question in the microphone. Here we go.
Yeah. I have the impression that the speakers, when they talk about China, that they forget that China is politically totally different ruled than our Western societies. And I have not heard the name CCP even one time.
Sure, I mentioned.
Sorry. Just to clarify, who do you? What's your question, and who do you ask the question to?
The Communist Chinese Party. And I think, at least I have the impression, that what happens in China, whether it is socially, economically, and militarily, on the field of arts, it is at the end, the Chinese Communist Party decides what way it goes or what way it not goes. And that is very much different from our societies.
Right. And so your question is?
The question is, well, why don't you mention that?
I think because there's a lot of different topics, but there are quite some examples needed of that. When I was doing my research on Chinese 3G, it was 2005. During that period, you had the president of China Mobile and the president of China Unicom, and they were swapped overnight, literally overnight. Why was that? Because they were thinking too much about shareholder value and not about the country. this would never happen, of course, in our world. This is really, really strange. So yes, it's completely. It's run like a company, the entire country. Or when also from that time, it makes it a bit easier to talk about that time for me, when Tsinghua Uni Group, an investment fund of Tsinghua University, acquired all the shares of Spectrum, which is like a Chinese version of NXP, of the stock market. So they bought the company completely off NASDAQ and nationalized it. Under university. It would be like the TU Delft bought all the shares of NXP to nationalize it under TU Delft. Those are completely different dynamics indeed taking place there.
That's a really interesting point. Thank you for opening the party door for me. I'm sure I mentioned it. I certainly mentioned censorship and surveillance. But indeed, one of the really interesting things, though, is that where, you know, Jaap, I completely agree when it's not much of a debate, is it? But I really agree when you say that we've been complacent. And one way in which we have been complacent is essentially by having government after government after government after government sort of throwing its hands up in the air and say, we don't do the vision thing. It's all up to the market will solve all of their problems. Where in China, you know, when we talk about the party, let's be real. Right? This is a massive, massive, massive organization that, you know, we sometimes has this idea that almost like a school of fish, they magically turn this way and that all the same way. No, this is a huge organization. If it were an independent country, it would be in the top 20 largest countries in the world by population. There are more party members in China than there are Germans in Germany. Right? So
18 million?
98.
98 million, okay. Yeah.
98 million party members, give or take. But this is what you get in China, scale. I was there 2 weeks ago, took the high-speed train from Shanghai to Beijing. You stop in a city called Bengbu. I'm a sinologist and I've never heard of Bengbu. And then you look it up on the Wikipedia. Turns out that Bengbu has 3.5 million people or so living in it. I'm sorry if anyone is from Bengbu and I've just insulted you. But this is a level of scale that we find very difficult to imagine. So the idea that this is a monolithic entity is just ludicrous. But what it can do, and this is really important, it can coordinate. And one of the studies in the book, actually 2 of the studies in the book, actually talk about how you can create local centers of excellence by integrating universities, companies, by building supportive infrastructure in a really, really interesting, intelligent, and very often learning manner. And I'm not saying, you know, that China has this massive master plan and does everything right. You know, the Chinese Communist Party is as prone to mistakes as all the rest of us. But there are these interesting ideas and approaches there, which I very often think we miss here, where because the Chinese Communist Party has its fingers in so many pots, it is actually able to pull these things together in a way that we can't really understand. So when we in Europe talk about, oh, the Chinese state is unfairly subsidizing the Chinese EV industry, it's actually really difficult to put its fingers on what they do, because they're not just giving a large stack of money to BYD. What they are is in directing state funds to make sure that there are trained engineers, by making sure that there is supporting infrastructure, by pulling together entire supply. Isn't it interesting how China seems to have decided to not relinquish a number of lower valued industries if they can be useful for the higher valued industries like rare earths? China is now apparently moving to restrict the export of rare earths, apparently in retaliation to the American semiconductor sanctions. But where those American sanctions are aimed at denial, you know, we don't want China to have these technologies, the Chinese measures seem to be aimed at upselling. China doesn't want to sell the rest of the world raw materials if it can sell them the batteries that you make with these raw materials, and even more preferably if you can sell the car that those batteries are mounted into.
Those are, of course, a little bit the overly optimistic examples, because when I wrote the paper in 2014, I already mentioned at that time with examples and data how China was also using money from tenders. So you have a company that doesn't have the technology, they win a local tender for wind turbines, or they get the money up front, and with the money they acquire a European company with said technology.
Exactly.
that's
you know, I'm not saying that we should like it, but it's not stupid, right? It's not unintelligent.
Yes.
That is my point. And so if you are talking about the party, we're talking about an organization that, yes, on the one hand, it's very clearly not a democratic organization. It is very clearly capable of inflicting significant levels of cruelty on people inside China too. But it is also clever of these other things.
True. I did actually find a point where we disagree upon. Earlier, you mentioned that we, as the democratic country, we have a decision to decide whether or not to use a certain system. Yes and no. When I was in China, at some point, I didn't want to use all the functionality of WeChat anymore. But if I wanted to be in a certain large group, I had to link my bank account. Otherwise, you can't join a group of 100 or 500 people. If WeChat would have spread over the world, you would have to enroll, like it's same, like you can decide not to have an email address. Mm-hmm. You can decide not to have a mobile phone. Good luck with your career. So people all have LinkedIn. We share information on LinkedIn. It's kind of difficult to apply for a job if you don't have LinkedIn. So you don't always have the choice if technology being spread over the world and you're using the standard. Like a lot of municipalities in the Netherlands, they use cameras that they shouldn't use. Why? Well, because they're good and cheap. And that combination makes them very a realistic choice.
No, exactly. And just my argument there would be that this is exactly the reason why WeChat hasn't spread outside of China, right? WeChat users, by and large, are Chinese people, or people with a PRC passport, members of the Chinese diasporic community, or people like myself who regularly interact with the aforementioned two groups. And I think that's exactly the reason, right? So it seems in Europe, the market even militates against these things before governments need to. So I'm just very skeptical about the idea that technology can sort of roll across the world uncontrolled by local politics, because it doesn't seem to happen.
There's maps out there where you can see all the Chinese IoT devices ping all over the world. It's a bright, shiny world. Okay.
I also want to add to Rogier's point before and about the party's role. I think if South Koreans say that three things that you can't avoid in life is death, tax, and Samsung, and then in China it's going to be death, tax, and the party, right? And then so the role of the party is omnipresent, it's just everywhere. But I feel it's also important to recognize that the party is not a unitary actor. That it's just even within the party. For example, this the central government is not always aligned with local governments, and then so in policies. When it comes to this technology development, I think the party, and I mean this a central level party, this highest leaders, they can set some priorities and also red lines, what do they want to prioritize on, and then also lines you can't cross. For example, you cannot endanger national security, public security, and the political regime. But actually, when it comes to implementation, that is actually it's very contested. And then local actors and also actors from other sectors, including private companies and also academia and so on, they have come up with their own initiatives. And then, of course, they too implement this the goals set by the party, but still just that process itself is contested and dynamic. Yeah.
Thank you. This is great, by the way. You don't need me at all. It's fantastic. But nonetheless, there's a question here, so please.
Thank you.
Who is the question directed to?
To Rogier, but also to the other people on the table. One of the geopolitical players I didn't hear yet, and I hear Rogier at the beginning of the speech says, Apple cannot replace the manufacturing base without China. You see, now Apple has de-risked its country, or its country risk, by putting some of its manufacturing base in India. So my questions to you is actually, how do you see this relationship India and China? As you see more and more European companies are looking also to India to do their manufacturing.
Yes, it's interesting, is it? We live a life that essentially requires the immiseration of hundreds of millions of people around the world. And so if we can't immiserate Chinese people anymore, we need to look for a next community of poor sods to victimize, which in this particular case is becoming India. When you say Apple has de-risked, Apple is trying to de-risk, right? Apple has a plan to, over the next 4 or 5 years or so, move 15 to 20% of its iPhone production to India. I think we're at about 4% also in Brazil right now. You know, that means that in 4 or 5 years' time, still 80+% of the manufacturing of Apple's key product is still going to happen in China. And already what we're starting to see is that the India project is running into considerable difficulty, because this isn't just about building a factory. This is about building the supply chain that feeds the factory. It's about building the transportation infrastructure that takes the goods out of the factory. It's about having the skilled workers who are able to perform those jobs in the factory, and so on and so forth. And what we see there is that in very many ways, this is a political problem, right? The Indian government simply does not have the same coordinating power in terms of getting this stuff done that Chinese governments have exhibited. So this is actually quite difficult. But somewhat more broadly speaking, I guess the question is, can India become a geopolitical rival to China in that sense? Or can India become a way for us to de-risk? Perhaps. But what I'd like to also do is draw your attention to the fact that even though we like to see India as friendly, the food is amazing. It really is. And you know, it's the largest democracy in the world. But what if de-risking from China means re-risking somewhere else, right? What I hear Gina Raimondo, the US Secretary of Commerce, a couple of months ago refer to Narendra Modi as a visionary paragon of democratic ideals. Now, there are many words by which that one could use to refer to Narendra Modi, but visionary paragon of democracy isn't among my top 10. And we've seen this movie before, right? So what if it is the case, right? We've seen this movie before in the sense that this is how George Bush Sr. would talk about Deng Xiaoping. So what if, you know, a lot of these geopolitical issues are actually structurally decided? What if, let's say, just for the sake of the argument, that we move a lot of that China manufacturing to India, and India goes through a trajectory that is very similar to the Chinese one? What might it then be the case that 20, 30 years from now, we're going to be in the exact same position with regard to India that we are today with China?
I think... Can I just, did you have a question? Did I see that right? Okay. Before, and there's a question over there. Before we go to that, just a quick tussentijdse poll. Who still feels worried about the situation in China? That's hardly any less. Okay, sadly. Okay, let's go. Please, sir.
Yes, a question to Rogier. You mentioned about the development in China, the technology and development. How come then that Jack Ma's success has been banned and put basically, he's expelled from the country? What's the rationale behind that? And the other comment I want to make on iPhone, effectively, the whole business is run by Foxconn, which is a Taiwanese company. So clearly the reason why they established in China was pure labor cost.
Let me take those 2 points in turn. What happened to Jack Ma? What happened to Jack Ma is what I would like to see happen to Elon Musk. No, that is an obvious joke. But it actually may be useful to think about it in those terms, right? By the way, if you are suffering from insomnia, I have written 15,000 words about that, which I'm happy to email to you. But the short version of that is the Chinese government came to the conclusion that platform companies, that big tech as we know it, actually isn't that good for society and actually isn't that innovative and actually was generating a little bit too much risk. Pretty much the same that we are now thinking about our big tech as well, just, with some soy sauce and chopped spring onion on top. What do I mean with that? For starters, the Chinese government came to the conclusion that much of what these platforms are doing was happening anyway. So it's not new economic activity, it's displacement. When we lived in Beijing 20 years ago, I had in my desk drawer a couple of menus of local delivery restaurants, and I had a phone, and I had a stack of notes. And if I was hungry and I couldn't be buggered to go out for food, I would call them up with the landline phone, and they would come and bring my food, and I would pay for them in cash. And now I do that through an app, and I have a somewhat bigger selection of restaurants that come and deliver, and the payment is slightly more convenient, but it actually doesn't meaningfully alter, in the eyes of the Chinese government, the efficiency, productivity, and global competitiveness of the core of the Chinese economy. So, right? E-commerce is just another way of convincing people to drop 50 RMB for a t-shirt. So the government came to the conclusion that economically, these companies do not necessarily contribute much to the sustainable development of China's economy. One. Two, from a financial perspective, particularly Jack Ma was running his country, his company, Ant Group, essentially as an unregulated bank. And this is a country that is extremely concerned about financial risk, or at least the financial risk that it doesn't generate itself through over-indebted local governments, but about things like fintech, experimenting with lending, experimenting with asset management, with very poor timing at a point where there was a P2P lending sector which had exploded and then imploded, resulting in billions of yuan of harm to very often very ordinary investors. And I don't know if you remember the 2008 crisis, when it seemed like half of the Netherlands had their money in Iceland, right? You get a very similar reaction in China. Why did you not protect us? So there was a point where the Chinese government was going to become a lot more strict about regulating fintech. They were happy with payment. Right? Payment is just moving money around. They were not happy with lending, credit, wealth management products. And they essentially started telling Jack Ma, if you behave like a bank, we're going to regulate you like a bank, and you're going to risk manage like a bank. Jack Ma, obviously believing that, big tech has solved all of these problems of risk management, wasn't very happy with that, knew the regulations were coming, was pushing ahead with his initial public offering anyway. That would have been the biggest IPO in history. He saw the regulations that would be coming, but that weren't publicly available yet. And if he didn't, then certainly his staff would have done. Gets more desperate, gives an extremely ill-advised speech right after the vice premier, I believe, of China gives a speech. Jack Ma comes on stage, contradicts him. And it's this combination of political and policy issues, right? It's not right to just say, Jack Ma gives a speech, Xi Jinping hears about it, gets really angry, and orders Jack Ma to be slapped down. There was a big policy push that was building up.
The gentleman talk about the CCP. The reaction is, of course, different. Here in Europe, you'll be fined, not disappeared.
But he wasn't. This is the point. We don't quite know what happened there. But in essence, it seems to have been a battle of wills to get this IPO through, where at some point the IPO had to be cancelled because the regulations became public and it became very clear that this would have a massive impact on Ant Group's business model. We don't quite know whether he was disappeared or whether he chose to lay low because he had just cost a whole bunch of people across the Asian financial world a few $1 billion, and they wouldn't have been happy with it.
But basically you're saying there's more rationale behind it than just politics. It's more
exactly
than just a power struggle or
exactly. And the second, right? And your second question was?
It was more an observation, if I heard you correctly.
No, I just said that the whole infrastructure for Apple.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yes. Yes. Why Taiwanese companies? Actually, Taiwanese companies when I was a kid, all of my toys were made in Taiwan or made in Hong Kong. Then, and that was the point where China was opening up. Taiwanese companies came to the conclusion that they could play a really important intermediary role, where they could use, where they could exploit low labor cost in China, but they could position themselves as intermediaries between a Chinese business environment that many foreign companies would not trust, right? And the rest of the world that would commission the goods. And very many companies in Taiwan and in Hong Kong, one way or another, have played that role. In fact, when you look at financial flows, during the 80s and early 90s, the single largest source of foreign finance and investment are Hong Kong and Taiwan, very often because they serve that role of windows to the world. Now, however, and this is not me, this is again Tim Cook from Apple, says that we're no longer in China for the cost. You know, Chinese laborers aren't that cheap anymore, but we are there because it's the only place in the world that does what we need and reliably does what we need.
I'd like to touch back on a point that you made earlier. Both Jaap and Rogier, I think. Jaap, you talked about that some technologies, if they become like big enough, it's very hard to evade them, like WeChat. And then Rogier, you argued that you think the free market can kind of rule out these companies if they are privacy invading, for example. But isn't TikTok a prime example of this happening in Europe and the free market just accepting it? Because I think TikTok has broken various European privacy laws, and if I look at my friends around me, everyone is using it. So
yeah, please, you go first.
I have no comment. That's my point, basically. That's no. It's indeed when technology becomes ubiquitous, it's hard to not to separate yourself from that. What I think is that. I often see China just as an actor that does what it does for its own reasons, and I see China being run as a company. If I run my company as a company, I want to make sure that I do best for my staff in terms of benefits, in terms of like outcompeting the competition. So I will leave no stone unturned, and I will even, if you're an entrepreneur, you know that, find the gray lines, because that's where the money is being made. And you always figure out where is the gray line, because in the rest there's like all the competition. That's the red ocean. China also does that. So it's constantly looking like, where can I find new technology? Can I do this? Can I do this? Can I get away with this? And if we in Europe are not checking, so we have rules, but we don't have the tools to actually check them, or we just have privacy rules, but we don't enforce them on foreign companies, then you're lost. Then only your own companies are being like hurt by the regulations. For a long time, like we had investment screening regulations. But investment screening, people couldn't check who the true owner was in China. Export regulation, the same. People have no idea where they're exporting to, or where data is being shipped to. There's plenty of examples out there. I feel the politicians and the people, the civil servants, are still ill-equipped when it comes to their knowledge and the expertise they need for this, on this topic as well.
Before you start, Rogier, just a quick follow-up question to you, because the worries are still there. It's sometimes not very well defined, but it's kind of a feeling of unease. Is the sort of better rules and regulations that are actually enforced by European authorities or Brussels, for all I care, a way to allay those fears, to make those fears less, do you think?
Definitely. And if you enforce those regulations, hopefully you can get into a dance with China again, where you agree to disagree on like a huge amount of topics, but you at least, when you implement rules and regulations, stick to them. It's otherwise it's like the same if you would have 50 kilometers per hour board in your hometown, and people drive like 100 all the time. And people feel like, okay, this is like this Dutch government is not doing anything. If you put the board there 50 kilometers max, stick to it. And then eventually cars will drive 50 kilometers per hour. China will follow more of our rules if we make them stick to our rules in Europe. And that's.
Do you see any signs of that happening already?
Yes, it will become a little bit of a whack-a-mole. After the investment screening regulations were implemented, there was a decrease, also for various other reasons, of Chinese acquisitions of European high-tech companies. But then they moved to acquiring more of our technology. So dual-use export shot up like threefolded the years afterwards. So then you have to check that again. So it will be a bit of a whack-a-mole. Yes, that's the same what a company will also do. There's always looking for the boundaries. Where can I make money? Where can I get, in their case, the new science, the technology that I need to build my economy, to upgrade the people to a higher level of income? And again, even if you agree with everything China does, their growth, there will be friction with our economy. That's a fact of life. Don't deny that, and just deal with it.
And that friction will only grow.
That friction will only grow. And if you think like this is just China, Boris Johnson wanted to invade the Netherlands. If you have enough problems in your country, you will do strange things.
Well, or enough problems in your brain when you're talking about Boris Johnson.
There's still an outstanding question to you.
Sorry, could...
Do you remember what the question was?
Yeah, TikTok. I don't think we're just accepting it. In fact, TikTok has been made to work very hard on GDPR compliance. And I have a hunch, if you actually look at TikTok's practices where it comes to GDPR, as well as compliance with the Digital Market Services Act, as well as the upcoming AI Act, I wouldn't be surprised if TikTok is actually the more compliant kid in the classroom in comparison with Twitter, also known as X social media, and all of the Facebook apps, simply because they have that big target painted on their back on the one hand, and the other hand is that indeed the question really is, what is the problem that you want to solve? If you believe that it's a national security risk that a Chinese-owned social media application is popular in your market, then the only way to stop that is for you to, stop it from being Chinese-owned, as the Trump administration has tried, or to stop it from being on your market, as Montana has tried. By the way, just to give an illustration of the national security insanity that the United States is now subject to, just last week, a Republican senator has requested the Secretary of Commerce to launch an investigation on the national security risk of imported garlic from China, fresh and tinned. Right, but so on the TikTok point, if that is your risk, the only way to solve it is to make the company stop being Chinese or to make it stop being on your market. If, however, you want to look at the behavior of the company and see what it does, then you regulate and you make sure that you invest in enforcement. And the European Union in very many areas has been very good at that. Just look at the Google cases and the Microsoft cases in areas of anti-competition. But we do need to become far stricter. And again, it's one of these problems that doesn't just bedevil us where, I think our anti-government attitude has brought us quite a few problems. But particularly in technology, there's this wonderful almost poem called The Declaration of Independence in Cyberspace, originating from the dusty depths of the libertarian 90s, that literally says, cyberspace, there is no place for you, O governments, giants of the era of iron and steel. Right? Governments have nothing to do in the digital realm, and we still have that idea, and we have it in Europe pretty bad. In the United States, it's a terminal disease, right? Where the country is simply incapable of recognizing that the digital sphere does not automatically generate stuff that's that is for the benefit of humankind. The interesting thing, though, and this is probably an opportunity for debate, perhaps it's not surprising that TikTok, of all the major social media platforms, is the most moderated.
That's some food for thought. But while we are thinking about that, there's a question here, and there's a question over there. I'd like you to address your question to one speaker for the sake of the time.
Okay, I'm not sure. Whoever feels like taking this question, please go ahead. So also my question is kind of two questions at the same time. As we speak, there's obviously like still an ongoing genocide in Xinjiang, Uyghur genocide, right? So I'm curious about how you think that might influence all of the themes that we discussed, and how that might influence like China's soft power, and like conversely, like in parallel, we see China's soft power actually like being more positive in recent years. So I'm curious about how you see that.
Who wants to take this one?
I'll step on the third rail. What's going on in Xinjiang very clearly is very deeply unpleasant. My argument would be, and I'm going to be a little bit controversial here, is that we don't really care about Xinjiang in anywhere near to what we claim, right? Without wanting to say anything about how bad it is what's going on in Xinjiang, what I see in our politics is that for us, Xinjiang is the stick to hit a dog with. If we actually cared about people from Xinjiang, we would be much, much stricter in things like rules of origin requirements in the fashion industry to make sure that no products from that region entered European markets. We would have something to actually say about the presence of Volkswagen there. We would have immigration structures that would make it far easier for Uyghurs to gain asylum status in the Netherlands, even a path to residence or citizenship. We would invest in these people so they could learn the language and they could gain qualifications. Unless and until we do that, I'm very sorry, I cannot see concerns about Xinjiang as being as serious as we make them out to be in relation to what seems to be our geopolitical enemy du jour. So let's put our money where our mouth is. What I would argue is that indeed it's one of these things that is contributing to the image of China as the big bad China. And the thing with soft power is, one of the things that's really interesting is I often have a hard time convincing people that China domestically is a lot more competently run than we give it credit for, because the part of it that we see in the West very often is the most incompetent part, and that is its diplomatic and foreign propaganda, foreign media outlets who are just usually tone deaf, right? Whether it was wolf warrior diplomacy, right? China could have played the whole diplomatic game around the pandemic, for instance, 1,000,000 times better than it did. It made unforced error after unforced error, creating hostility where that isn't necessary, and actually failing to come up with a message that is actually attractive. When I go on social media, particularly on X, I get a lot of ads by Saudi Aramco, because I guess that's the last advertiser that will still advertise on there. But this Saudi Arabia is better at foreign advertising than China is. That should tell you a lot.
Jake, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your speeches so far. Rogier began this talk showing off his brand new sexy supercomputer in his pocket. But my question pertains to the rather hideous, accursed black boxes that occupy our desks, or at least most of our desks. I'm talking about enterprise desktop PCs and laptops that, as a matter of fact, make hundreds of millions of different enterprises, be they state-owned and private, run across the world. And specifically in China, there's been a shift towards fully domestically produced silicon and motherboards across all SOEs and ministries by 2027. Now, we talk a lot in the EU about de-risking from China, but I haven't heard much around how China interprets de-risking, especially around vulnerabilities around, I think as Jaap brought up earlier, the vulnerabilities around IoT devices. I think China sees a lot of vulnerabilities in AMD and Intel with their microcode vulnerabilities and such. So my question really is, how does China see de-risking, and how does it deal with its sensitive sectors?
To be clear, who are you asking this to?
All of them, why not?
No, just you have to pick one, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Thank you for the question. China is de-risking in many different ways. Already for a very long time, they made a list of certain secure sectors where if you supply technology to that, you have to give the source code. So if you would provide a chip to the banking sector, or definitely military. But like there's this lengthy list. You would have to provide the source code so they could check this. Then in the more recently in the semiconductor industry, they tried to get an ARM license, ARM, for developing their own chips. Now they're hoping to jump on the risk boat. For people who don't know that, like these are how to create a chip that you can use in a computer. There's different ways to actually make this chip do calculations, but to really invest like an instruction set that you can run on a chip, massive endeavor, so people don't do that again anymore. All the stuff is like from the the 80s, even before that, from the US, with ARM being a British endeavor. Many backdoor deals have been done, like ARM license actually is in China, so China can use that to build some of their chips. But China is hoping that the RISC open source instruction set can be used for creating their own chips. Well, they're even promoting open source communities to make more efforts in this. So I think that's one of their key pathways, because it's the only way for them to really build up a new sector. Again, also because you need the low, a different kind of instruction set works better, especially also if you think into AI. People often think about now the NVIDIA chipsets, of course, or the chips, which is nice, but basically a GPU is something built for something else. Games you're using for AI now, but and there's many efforts in China to build neuromorphic chips or other types of like AI chips that are way better at solving, or even analog chips solving AI computations, and then RISC can also be a good effort at that. So, that's the answer.
Thank you. We're almost at the end. I have one final question for Ms. Chow, because you said earlier that we tend to exaggerate China's level of organization when it comes to cyber and AI and so on and so forth. And it's actually a little bit more messy than we tend to have the impression. So what do you feel China should do to allay the worries that people have here? In their communication, perhaps, or in their...
It's actually like just a question that I posed to like some government people quite recently, that I asked them that, like you are concerned about this like flowing around of like misinformation about China, and then why don't you make some clarifications about that? And then they said that actually like these people are from Ministry of Information Industry and Information Technology, and then they said they tried before like issuing some like just kind of like 3 or 4 reports each year, and then to kind of like clarifying some like common misses about China each year. And then just the problem is that just like it's a kind of it's not really widely circulated in the West. And then so like like we like just people in Western countries, you have this like social media you're used to and the websites you use, and then even like Chinese like authorities and also other actors are trying to maybe just make some clarifications. The message doesn't really come through, and then I think that just like we as academics, that we can play a role here, and then so hopefully, I think Rogier's new book is going to probably provide some new understandings of this China's technology development, and also this policy making dynamics. And also I think we have this actually we often ignore this kind of dialogues that are actually going on that are work to promote understanding between the two sides, and then so including both government to government talks and also other track 2 dialogues. We call track 2 means those informal dialogues, even though can be participated by some officials in their private capacities or as observers.
Thank you.
If that addresses your question.
That's great. Thank you very much. The whole evening has kind of. I mean, I have this quote in the back of my head the whole time, and I think a lot of you said something along the same lines. Is something I heard the other day. We tend to because it's China, we tend to exceptionalize and essentialize China, which is ridiculous to try and sum up a whole country of 1.4 billion people in a sentence. And we also tend to exceptionalize it, and the advice I got was don't. Simple as that.
Yeah.
It's a state with...
If to add to that, I actually recently came across a really interesting article. It's written by Robert Jervis, and then he wrote about this hypothesis of misconceptions. And then I think one of this he talked about this a security dilemma, especially between the U.S. and China in particular. I think there are many misconceptions, and one is kind of to fit this incoming information with some established theories and images, and then we are so wedded to this established understandings, and then so kind of keep us close to some new information. I feel for us, I always encourage my students to keep an open mind, just because a country that from a different cultural background of a political regime, and then you cannot just assume that it's just totally different, right? And then I feel it's actually interesting to unpack the complexity there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We've scratched the surface, at least. And of course, there is a third round at the bar, so I'd like to invite you to all go and have a drink. But not before I've thanked you for coming and participating so actively, and our speakers, Xiao Guangyu, Ms. Rogier Creemers, and Jaap van Eyck. Thank you so much. And last but not least, of course, I'd like to thank Zara Toxus, who's been a great help of the Balie with putting together the program. So much. And keep following us on our website.